Hello and welcome to the history of the superpower known as the European Union. Many know it has its roots in the Second Great War, but we will look in detail at the unlikely chain of events that led to two weak European powers challenging the balance of power of the entire world. Now, the Second Great War is such a large and complicated topic that we are going to have to restrict ourselves in this series to specifically look from the point of view of Franco-Spain, or as it was known at the time, France. The story begins in 1936. France in 1936 found itself in, quite frankly, a terrible position. It had an incredibly inefficient economy, thanks to lack of development, and this was exacerbated by the fact that there was simply not enough skilled workers, many having died in the Great War. Moreover, France's government was horribly disjointed, with large splits between the democratic, communist, and right-wing movements within France, leading to a government that was barely able to pass the simplest of legislation. The ineptness of this government was only all the highlighted by her neighbour in Germany, where a young painter had taken power and was thoroughly enacting a series of reforms to redefine the German economy. Many in France were nervous of this new rising power in the East. However, others looked on with jealous eyes, and right-wing favour within the country began to grow as people looked to emulate their strong eastern neighbour. Now, 1936 France did have several major advantages. A large colonial empire to fuel it and get over the manpower restrictions, a large and sizable navy, and perhaps most importantly, the knowledge gained from the Great War. In the previous Great War, they had shown how strong trench warfare could be, and this would form the basis of the French army's military development and doctrine, which would prove invaluable in the wars to come. But what was the emergent France to do? The number one priority was decided to be to unite the government, as without a cohesive government there was no way any progress could be made on any of the social or economic issues. Emulating her eastern neighbour, France decided to shift to the right, and the National Bloc was revived, a conglomeration of right-wing powers, including fascists and monarchists, coming together to oppose the liberal communist left. But this alone was not enough, and this was highlighted by the remilitarization of the Rhineland, a major breach of the Treaty of Versailles by Germany, to which the disjointed and broken government could only issue muted objections, which was seen in Germany as tantamount approval of the remilitarization. Although this did have the beneficial effect of thawing the Franco-German relations, it did highlight that something more radical needed to be done within the French government. And thus, to combat the communist threat, right-wing leagues were utilized to combat them directly on the streets of France. Now, the shift to the right was not isolated in Europe. Notably, in April of 1936, a group of young Japanese officers managed to stage a coup, putting Emperor Hirohito once more as the leader of Japan, not just in name, but in practice. Over in France, the political situation became all the more dire, as not only was the Second London Naval Treaty signed, thus limiting French power in the seas, but at the same time, communists were allowed into government, something the right wing could not abide. The growing popularity and strength of the army and navy did lead to some major reforms, most notably the complete reorganization of the French navy, and thus three navies were defined: the Atlantic Navy, the Mediterranean Navy, and the submarine fleets. We shall return to these in another episode, where we see them playing a decisive role in the Second Great War. But returning to the government front, there was really nothing more to do. The growing popularity of communism simply could not be allowed, and the decisions high up in leadership was made that the French Revolution was an experiment that had to be put to an end. The only way to restore order and a functioning government was a return to the monarchy, and so leaders set about completely rewriting the French constitution with a notable focus on re-establishing a true monarchy in one of Europe's oldest and grandest kingdoms. As France grappled with her own constitution, in the south Spain began its own violent attempt to re-establish a functional government. September 1936, the Spanish Civil War began, with right-wing and left-wing elements meeting each other in fierce street-to-street combat. Although many in France argued for intervention on the side of the Republicans or on the side of the right-wing military, with the broken, disjointed government only being able to focus on one thing at a time, no action was taken. The struggles between the right and the left spread throughout Europe, notably in Estonia, where, inspired by their Spanish cousins, in January of 1937, the Estonian Communist parties attempted to seize control. The war in Spain, however, reached a stalemate, and Spain requested aid in the form of armaments from her northern neighbour. The French government quickly accepted. However, there was a deep division as to which Spain to send armaments to, with half the government supporting the Republicans in the south, and the other half supporting the nationalists in the north. This debate would continue, and no armament shipments were ever sent from France to Spain. While the war in Spain had all but frozen, the war in Estonia, on the other hand, was reaching its end. After 3 months of bitter fighting, the socialists managed to achieve victory. Upon hearing the news, the German Führer gave his now infamous speech.
Here's hoping that there's another civil war in Russia then.
This recording made infamous for the fact, not just because of Hitler's inexplicable Australian accent, but also the timing, as no sooner had the Führer dispensed with these words than he was handed the following telegram. The Soviet Union was indeed at civil war, with a loose conglomeration of right-wing supporters joining together to form the Russian Provisional Government. It certainly seemed to all the world that right-wing sentiment was growing in Europe, and perhaps a return to the old order of monarchies dominating the world was about to happen. In Germany, the Führer, a king in all but name, solidified his support with the Anschluss of Austria. Meanwhile, in Spain, the deadlock was only broken by the disintegration of the Republicans into 2 distinct camps, the Democratic Republicans staying true to their original course, and the extreme left anarchists who rose up in the northeast of the country. The nationalists, however, were unable to use this to their advantage, and the front lines stayed relatively stationary. The nationalists, you see, were having their own internal power struggles, and these would eventually come to a head in July of 1937, where the Carlists would break away from the fascists' right. This led to a 4-way civil war. And although on paper the Republicans looked to dominate, having control of the vast majority of the country, they proved to be completely unable to secure the 3 breakaway powers in the north. Mirroring events that took place in the country that birthed her, Mexico also fell into a violent civil war, this time between the left-wing communists and the right-wing Christian Union. At this point, the writing was on the wall. Europe was going to descend into anarchy along with the rest of the world. Wars were breaking out in every corner. And so the French military, ignoring what was going on with the government, decided to make their own plan. Drawing from experience gained in the Great War, one thing was very clear. The future of warfare was in tanks. And not just any tanks. The heaviest, slowest, most powerful tanks were the ones to bring victory. Although the French army did have large numbers of light tanks to exploit breakthroughs, those breakthroughs would be made by infantry. Infantry supported by a new class of tank, the infantry tank. Although it was very quickly agreed upon that the tank needed to be heavily armoured and need not move any faster than a man's slow walking pace, there was still a vicious debate within the French Design Bureau. One side favoured that these tanks, being infantry support vehicles, should carry large caliber howitzers in order to destroy bunkers, fortifications, and heavily defended infantry positions. The other side pointed to France's likely enemies, namely the British across the Channel. The British, being the inventors of the tank, would no doubt field their own modern varieties. Therefore, it was argued that the infantry tank must be able to take on enemy armour as well, and so needed an anti-tank gun capable of such a thing. This debate continued until a young designer by the name of Renault came to the obvious solution. Instead of choosing between a howitzer and an anti-tank gun, the new B1 would be equipped with both. A large caliber howitzer operated in a two-man turret, and then a one-man turret to carry the anti-tank ordnance, equipped with a diesel engine and wet ammo storage to make sure that the tank would be reliable even in the inhospitable environment of Britain. This tank was put into immediate mass production as the B1 Heavy. As the first B1 prototypes rolled off the production lines in France, the civil war in Russia intensified, with numerous republics breaking away. These included Ukraine, a democratic state on the Black Sea, and Belarus, a strange country that was formerly democratic, however, was clear to all observers was actually a fascist state. Inspired by their Western cousins, the republics of Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Uzbekistan broke away from their Soviet overlords. Meanwhile, the provisional government in the east won a series of decisive victories and captured Vladivostok. The writing was on the wall. The Soviet Union was doomed. In this environment of growing disfavour for communism, the French government was finally able to deliver the new constitution, which clearly allowed the position of a monarch, and set about immediate work repealing the law of exile, so that the new French monarch could actually sit on a throne in France. The French military, happy with the first deliveries of their B1 Heavy, went about looking at the probable war zones, and one threat was clearly identified in the neighbouring Italy. Now, fighting over the Alps would prove to be no problem according to the French High Command. However, there was serious issues spotted in the neighbouring colonies in Africa, where French and Italian colonies looked over a border at each other. Belatedly, the French military realised that they had near to no logistical support in the region, and supplies were currently being delivered by truck, handwagon, and donkey across the northern African desert. To rectify this, a new train line and supply depot were set up for the express purpose of supplying troops with ammunition for their push into the Italian Tunisia. The first external challenge to the French Empire came in the form of the Turkish Empire demanding a return of some Syrian territory, namely that of Hatay. The French government rejected this, partially still based upon the simple fact that they could not process the legislation required to hand over any French territory. With war brewing across the world and threats now to French sovereignty, it was finally time, and the last drafts of the Constitution were pushed forward, and with great acclaim, Alphonse I was coronated on the 25th of April 1938. The French Republic was over, and the Bourbon monarchy under a true legitimate Carlist king was born. Stability in France was followed swiftly 6 months later by stability in Russia, as in July 1938 the Russian Second Civil War was drawn to a close with a victory for the provisional government. However, that was not the end of the struggles of Russia, as it had given up much of its integrity to win the Civil War. Moreover, it had made the fateful decision to agree to be a puppet of the Empire of Japan. Internal strife was also heavy, as the provisional government was united only in that they hated the Bolsheviks. With the Bolsheviks gone, it was very unclear as to what exactly this new government stood for, with large numbers of communists still currently in the country. Then, on the 28th of November 1938, the last vestiges of Anglo-French cooperation collapsed, when the British spy codename Snow was captured operating in Paris, and quickly put to death. Never again would the French trust the British, and the old rivalry between the two kingdoms had been thoroughly re-established. Instead, France began to pursue closer ties to Germany, who was seen as a natural ally against the Communists and the British. This led, in 1939, Germany declaring war on Poland in January, with the blessing of the French government. Much of the French population still distrusted an alliance with Germany after the horrors of the Great War, and so Marcel Boucard was appointed to build up fascist favour within France to make an alliance more palatable to the population. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht moved swiftly in Poland, invading with incredible strength across the entire front line. Initially, Polish resistance was stronger than expected around East Prussia, but this was soon countered with the deployment of 23 divisions via the Baltic. In short succession, Danzig was completely encircled, shortly followed by the fall of Warsaw. And then on the 13th of March 1939, Poland capitulated. As things were looking up for Germany, events were taking a downturn in France, with the rise of political violence once again, the left-wing organisations objecting to the government's more pro-fascist stance. With the threat of civil war from the communists, Alphonse took steps that many autocrats have done throughout history when faced with internal division, and he focused the public on an external threat by declaring war. The nature of this war would be in the south, as Alphonse had a good claim as a fellow Carlist to the crown of Spain, and therefore sought to put an end to the Spanish Civil War and lead the monarchists to overall victory. The first 5 divisions of the King's Guard, equipped with the new powerful B-1 tanks, were deployed, ready to help the offensive. And in June 1939, As news reached that Portugal itself was descending into civil war, the Kingdom of France formally entered the Spanish Civil War on the side of the legitimist Carlist monarchy. Until now, the borders in the Spanish Civil War had changed very little. See that the overall world powers had taken very, very little interest in this local civil war, one of many taking place across the world. Germany was saving her own strength for her own wars. Russia, although favouring the communists, was too busy having its own civil war. America was pursuing a policy of neutrality, and France was too disorganised to pick a side until now. This meant that the vast majority of the armies operating in Spain were severely lacking equipment, a situation that the French divisions used to their advantage. The anarchists in the northeast of the country were the first targets. Their disorganisation allowed the French divisions to simply walk in, seizing most of the anarchist-occupied lands within a few short days. Meanwhile, the French light divisions were dispatched to attack the nationalists in the west, the first target being the nationalist capital of Bilbao, which was rapidly encircled and then its garrison forced to surrender. However, even as the land forces made great gains, the navy suffered a humiliating defeat, as a submarine sent to sink enemy shipping was sunk by the nationalist forces. The great navy of France had been defeated in its first ever engagement in this brewing conflict. This was shortly followed by the Battle of the Iberian Coast between the Republican forces and the French Atlantic Fleet, in which once again the French lost a destroyer, only claiming a few transports in return. To further rub salt into the French Navy's wounded pride, a day later the anarchists surrendered to the advancing French military. Then, further cementing Franco-German relations, on the 5th of July, the Germans attacked Czechoslovakia. France, meanwhile, completely ignored its guarantee, allowing the invasion to take place and not assisting the Czechs. This invasion had already been discussed between the two governments, and so Germany had invaded, knowing full well the French would not so much as offer an objection. Czechoslovakia, much like Poland, was on her own. France's invasion of Spain, however, quickly stalled, as the oil requirements had been vastly underestimated. France's sudden adoption of so much motorised and heavy tank divisions quickly outstripped her entire fuel supply, and so France hurriedly began importing fuel from America. This decision to import all fuel from the United States would come back to haunt the French Empire in the years to come. But in the short term, it paid off. With the new supplies of fuel, the French light tank divisions were able to break through all across the nationalist front line and succeed in encircling almost the entire nationalist army, leading to the capitulation of the nationalist government on the 5th of August 1939. Now only the Republicans stood between the monarchists and total victory on the Iberian Peninsula. The French navy, meanwhile, finally came into its own. With much of the Republican fleet being heavily damaged, the French submarine fleets found themselves nearly unopposed, and they ran amok, sinking and destroying ships throughout the coastline of Spain. As the French army prepared for its final push south, events progressed quickly in the east. The provisional government finally came to the decision to coronate Vladimir III, returning the Russian monarchy. Days later, on the 23rd of August, 1939, the Czech government finally surrendered, after the 25 divisions encircled in Prague finally ran out of munitions and had to agree to end the conflict. Not wanting to be outdone by their German counterparts, the French army pushed south rapidly, encircling and then capturing Madrid and pushing inwards. However, as victory seemed within grasp, mid-September 1939, worrying news reached the young King Alphonse. The communists were plotting an imminent uprising. Having realized that the vast majority of the French military were busy in Iberia, they planned to strike quickly. Alphonse immediately pulled back all divisions from the Italian border to protect Paris, but the clock was now ticking. Time was running out. Either victory would be achieved in Spain, or the communists would overrun the entirety of France. As the end of September approached, and Germany invaded Yugoslavia once again with the French blessing, the French light divisions made a series of rapid advances, initiating a series of lightning attacks that would become synonymous with the French military. These finally succeeded in taking the Republican capital of Valencia on the 1st. And after over 2 years of constant fighting, the Spanish Civil War ended in a Carlist victory. The French army was rapidly redeployed to mainland France. However, the communists lost their nerve, seeing the large amount of battle-hardened divisions suddenly appear. The date of the uprising came and went without incident. Yugoslavia, meanwhile, quickly capitulated to the advancing Wehrmacht. In Russia, only a few months after coronating their new king, the fascist elements within the Russian government quickly dissolved the entire institution, placing Konstantin Grodzki in charge of the country. Another dictator, albeit still on the leash of his Japanese overlords. The Japanese shogunate, having put their favoured candidate in control of Russia, now turned their attention to one of the strangest episodes of the entire Second Great War, when they declared war on the communist enclave within China. This confused most observers, as Japan had no way of reaching this enclave. Most assumed that invasion of nationalist China would soon follow, but this never came. Instead, Japan merely called its puppet Russia into war, who equally had no way to get to the landlocked country. Back in Europe, after a little bit of debate, the Spanish were quickly instructed that the one true king of Spain was no other than the Carlist Alphonse. With their army devastated and their victory entirely reliant on the French forces, the Spanish had no choice but to accept this new fact. And thus was born the great power as we know it today, Franco-Spain. The Carlists, once forced out of Europe, had made a dramatic return. Following the wave of national support, the French government quickly used this as an opportunity to formally join the Axis, and set about a program of mass military factory construction across the entirety of the Franco-Spanish Empire. Turkey put aside her dislike of France and decided to also join in the Axis. They would be followed shortly later by the Japanese, securing the Axis as the world's major power. This did, however, lead America to finally abandon its neutrality, and America joined Britain in the Allies shortly after. This would not dissuade the newly empowered Axis from making gains across Europe, with the German invasion of the Benelux region. In June 1940, German and French troops crossed the border, overwhelming the Netherlands and Belgium in short order. The victorious Alphonse took the opportunity to outright ban communism within his country, thus in August of 1940 finally ending decades of civil strife. But Alphonse would not be satisfied with Spain, and his eyes turned towards his other southern neighbour of Italy. Speeches questioning Italy's right to exist and questioning whether the entirety of the Mediterranean should not naturally belong to the Axis. With tanks massing on the Italian border and battle plans being drawn, it was clear that the wars in Europe were only just beginning. What few knew was that this next conflict would trigger a much wider war. The Second Great War was about to ignite. But for that, you will have to join me next time. I have been Dr. J. Ebus, and this has been part 1 of the rise of that great empire known as the European Union. Thank you and good day.